All right, so we all think we know the story of the Trojan War, right? But what if I told you that legendary victory, the one with the giant wooden horse, was actually just the opening act for a total catastrophic collapse? Today, we're going to dig into the incredible story of what happened after Troy fell and how a civilization's darkest hour, believe it or not, ended up forging the world we know.
Yeah, let's really think about that for a second. Imagine you've just pulled off the greatest trick in military history. You've conquered a city that everyone said was unconquerable. You're expecting parades, right? Glory? Instead, you come home to find your entire world is literally turning to dust. That, right there, is the shocking, kind of hidden story behind the legend of Troy. So before we get to the collapse, you gotta understand just how high they were flying. Let's rewind the clock. We're talking the 13th century BCE. This is the peak of the late Bronze Age. And the Aegean Sea, it's basically the playground of one group, the super powerful Mycenaean civilization.
So who were these Mycenaeans anyway? Well, picture this. It's not one big empire, but a whole network of small kingdoms. Each one is ruled by a warrior king from inside a massive, heavily fortified palace. Think places like Mycenae or Pylos. These guys were the masters of the sea, totally dominating all the big trade routes. And they ran a really tight ship, a super organized top-down society. They even had their own form of writing, called Linear B, which they used for, the boring stuff, keeping meticulous records of taxes, trade goods, troop numbers, all that administrative jazz. Bottom line, this was a sophisticated, super wealthy, and very military-focused world.
And right there, sitting at this incredibly crucial choke point, was the city of Troy. I mean, look at its location. It was basically the gatekeeper for all the trade moving between the Aegean and the super resource-rich Black Sea. So if you're a maritime power like the Mycenaeans, Troy isn't just some rival city. No, it's a roadblock, a big, wealthy roadblock, and a very tempting target.
Okay, so that brings us to the war itself. And, we've all heard the story, right? Homer's epic, the Iliad. But here's the thing. History is almost never as neat and tidy as a poem. So let's do a little separating here. Let's pull apart the legend we all love from the actual history that archaeologists had been digging up.
And this is where it gets really interesting, when you put them side by side. On the one hand, the legend gives us this super dramatic, romantic reason for war, the abduction of Helen of Sparta. But history? It points to something a lot more practical, a good old-fashioned fight over those incredibly valuable trade routes. The legend talks about a 10-year siege and, of course, the giant wooden horse. In archaeology, well, it confirms that the city, which we now call Hisarlik, was in fact violently destroyed right around 1180 BCE. That's pretty much dead on for when this whole thing was supposed to have happened. So there's definitely something there.
So the Mycenaeans win. They did it. They conquered their greatest rival. This should have been their golden moment, right? The dawn of an even bigger, better age of power and wealth. But it was the exact opposite. What happened next was a collapse so sudden, so total, that it literally plunged the entire Mediterranean world into darkness for centuries. First, the very centers of their power just went up in flames. We're talking about the great palaces at Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, all of them systematically burned to the ground. Then, it's like their knowledge just evaporated. That Linear B script, gone. Disappeared completely. Writing itself was just lost for the next 400 years. And finally, the people scattered. The great cities were abandoned, left to crumble, as everyone fled to tiny, isolated villages. It's like the lights of civilization just got switched off. So you have to ask, what on earth could cause such a total system failure? And the really crucial thing to understand is that it wasn't just one thing, it was a perfect storm of disasters. Historians have a bunch of theories. There are invasions by these mysterious groups called the Sea Peoples. There's evidence of widespread internal rebellions. We know there was a series of devastating earthquakes. Their entire international trade network, the thing they depended on, just fell apart. And on top of all that, it looks like climate change was causing massive famine. I mean, any one of those things would be a major crisis, but all of them hitting at once, it was basically an apocalypse. And this catastrophic period that followed has a name. We call it the Greek Dark Ages. For about 300 years, the entire region was basically defined by everything it had lost: its people, its ability to read and write, and those big, complex, palace-run kingdoms of the Mycenaean heroes. But here's the amazing thing about history. It's always a cycle of collapse and renewal. So the Dark Ages, they weren't the end of the story. They were more like a giant reset button.
Because from the ashes of that old Mycenaean world, a completely new and, you could argue, an even more dynamic Greek civilization was about to be born. This timeline really puts the whole journey into perspective. So look here, around 1250 BCE, that's the absolute peak of Mycenaean power. Then, just a few decades later, bam, around 1180, Troy is destroyed. And that seems to be the trigger for the Great Bronze Age collapse and the start of the Dark Ages. And you can see it's a long, dark few centuries. Until finally, around 800 BCE, the lights start coming back on. The Archaic Age begins and a whole new Greece starts to take shape. So a big question, right? With writing totally gone, how did they even remember this age of heroes? Well, the answer is through stories. For hundreds of years, you had these traveling poets, these bards who would go from village to village, reciting these incredible epic poems about the glory of Achilles and the cleverness of Odysseus. The memory of Troy wasn't kept alive on clay tablets. It was kept alive in song. And then came the breakthrough, and it came from the sea. The Greeks came into contact with the Phoenicians and saw their writing system, so they adopted it. But they made one tiny, revolutionary change. They added vowels. It sounds simple, but this created the world's first true alphabet. And it was a system so simple, so efficient, that suddenly literacy wasn't just for a tiny group of professional scribes anymore. And what's one of the very first things they used this incredible new tool for? You guessed it, to finally write down all those epic poems about Troy. And this new world that was forming was built on some totally new ideas. First, you have the polis. Forget giant kingdoms. The new basic unit of society was the independent city-state, places like Athens and Sparta. From that foundation, you get this explosion of colonization, with Greeks spreading out and founding new cities all across the Mediterranean. And all of this movement, in turn, helped them forge a shared Greek identity. They were connected by common language, common gods, and these great pan-Hellenic sites like Olympia. Yeah, that Olympia, where the first Olympic Games were held way back in 776 BCE. Which brings us to our final and maybe the most important point of all. The actual historical war for Troy. It was probably just one of many, many conflicts happening back in the Bronze Age. But the story of the war? The story became something else entirely. Something so much bigger. And this quote right here just nails it. Think about it. You've got all these fiercely independent city-states that were constantly fighting with each other. For them, the story of Troy was this powerful reminder of a time, a heroic age, when they all fought together for a common cause. It became their shared origin story. So you see, the legacy of Homer's epic is just immense. It wasn't just a good story. It gave all the different Greek peoples a shared history, a common identity. It established this heroic code of valor and honor that every single citizen, whether you were a Spartan soldier or an Athenian politician, was expected to try and live up to. This story didn't just entertain people, it actively shaped their entire culture, and through them, it has echoed down and influenced Western civilization for millennia. So in the end, the great victory at Troy was immediately followed by a devastating collapse. And yet, out of those ashes, the memory of that victory, transformed into a powerful myth, became the very blueprint for a whole new civilization. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? It leaves us with one final question to think about. What are the stories, true or maybe just legendary, that we tell ourselves about our own past that are still shaping who we are today?